All right, my name's Peter. I work for a company called Cyrkl. It is a B2B marketplace for waste. So we make trash into cash. I'm a chief technology officer, so I'm handling everything from the microwave to all the software outages and stuff like this. I wish you a very good afternoon, and I really do hope that the coffee is already kicking in. So yeah, I came in from Prague, from Czech Republic, and yeah, in Czechia we have a very interesting thing. We pride ourselves that almost every household is recycling, quote unquote. What is actually happening? So the numbers say something between like 74% to 94% of households, which is impressive. When we talk about like plastics, it's 70% that supposedly is being recycled, but it's not really, because most of it is used as fuel. We burn that stuff. We don't create anything new from it, which is a huge problem. And yeah, coming from the tech scene, I consider technology a great driver, and I'm really happy to be in this panel and moderating this panel with some amazing guests, starting with a company that, among other things that I found, puts the CO2 savings just a photograph away from construction companies, and it's represented by Brittany. Warm-up question for you, Brittany. Qualis flow or Q flow? What's the correct phrasing?
So, I mean, technically the company is called Qualis Flow, but that's a bit of a mouthful. So we tend to just go by Q flow.
All right, so Brittany is the CEO of Q-Flow, and yeah, I'm excited to hear what you actually do and how you do that in terms of like urban recycling and everything around it.
Yeah, sure. So I started my career in civil engineering and absolutely fell in love with the construction industry because it's amazing. It literally builds the world around us. But it has this dark side. It's not very efficient, and it's certainly not very sustainable. And back in 2018, I met up with my co-founder, and we said, look, we're going to have to fix this. We've tried from the inside out. We tried within Bureau Happold. We tried within Skanska. And actually, we need to take a different approach. And when we started digging into why this industry was so unsustainable, we started coming across these horrific statistics, like 40% of all the materials consumed each year are in construction, and 40% of landfill is from construction. And we're like, this does not make any sense. Why are we doing this linear system when really we should be thinking about circular? And so what Q-Flow does is it makes it really easy for construction teams to track every single piece of material that comes onto site and all the waste that goes off. So you have a really detailed picture of your environmental impact, but also where the opportunity lies from a cost, from a quality, and from a reuse perspective. So through a photograph, they take a picture of the goods received note that comes on with those materials and the waste transfer note that goes off. We use a load of AI to extract all the information from those images and structure them into a database which we can then audit. We then flag risks to the construction team so that they can save time and money. But we also build this really rich database for developers and asset owners to see exactly what's gone into their buildings. So when they come to take those buildings apart again, they know exactly what can be reused. So our objective is to keep stuff out of the waste system as much as possible, keep it in life for as long as we can, and only allow things to go down that waste hierarchy from reuse to recycle to then disposal at the very last minute.
And would your technology be somewhat applicable on the other side of the life cycle of construction? So let's say like demolition or remolition?
Yeah, we're used extensively in demolition, primarily, sadly, tracking the waste that's going off. But what we're trying to do with that data to understand when a building has been demolished, how can that be used as a feedstock for big manufacturers, like the concrete manufacturers we were hearing from earlier. When you've got this crushed concrete, can that then become a feedstock for their processes again? So again, trying to keep that material at its highest value we possibly can.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Next in line, we have a company that provides sustainability analytics along with actionable advice, footprint intelligence. And we have their managing director, Daniel Scholz, here. Guys, how long are you in the market already?
Thank you very much. We are in the market since approximately 2 years, so not that long. We had the luck that we were able to, as a startup, develop during our jobs initially. We had that allowance from our previous employer. We've been in an industry, automotive, which was completely disrupted by CO2 in the last couple of years from the normal reporting, as many companies have to, but to their core product, which had completely to shift from electric mobility to hydrogen to anything. And while this industry transformed quite a bit, we were super upset about the fact that there is so much attention right now, there is so much hype at the moment. However, the action actually going into driving real impact is comparably little. And this is why we came up with Footprint Intelligence, which has in its core the decarbonization, which in many ways, and I hope I can tie to that in a second a little bit more, goes hand in hand with recycling and reduction of waste or even prolonging lifetime of products. Though this was the birth moment of Footprint Intelligence, we brought forward the decarbonization. We help companies now to really decarbonize effectively, not just be stuck with the reporting of their, for example, carbon emissions or sustainability for ages, which completely takes the capacity of everyone in the whole company for way too long compared to focusing on what we actually need, driving impact forward. We do so mostly at this stage for non-producing companies, which some might say, this might be easier. However, especially if it comes to virtual products, this gets much more complex because you cannot see and trace where is actually your products flowing. You have virtual things stored in multi-clouds. You have tons of end devices in various countries, and how to derive the carbon footprint and find potentials in this case is quite a big challenge.
All right, I can understand that. And so, yeah, you do provide companies with actionable advice. Do companies that work with you follow through? Do they do this stuff? And can you track it?
We do track it. And the good thing is, as soon as it becomes trackable, there is an incentive because, again, this little gas or all these greenhouse gases are invisible. And as soon as we make it kind of traceable and trackable, there is an incentive because it's a great communication message. Also, it's the so-called Scope 4 emissions. For the ones who are familiar with it, Scope 1 to 3 are the basic emissions. Scope 4 are those emissions which are actually the avoided emissions. And once they come trackable, you can really communicate amazingly. It's also tying into marketing or communicating with customers, investors, employees, whoever. For example, our company saved 200,000 tons last year. This is a big number now, but just coming up with anything, this is really, as soon as it's getting trackable, it's the changing point. You have an incentive to do so and to drive it forward.
Indeed. So yeah, we have two young companies, Qflow and Footprint Intelligence. And I have to admit, I never heard about them just before this conference. The one company I've heard of quite some is Rubicon. Now we're on to the big gun. We know about Rubicon mostly because it's a publicly traded company. Last year you went public. How was the ride since then?
Interesting, very interesting. I learned a lot.
All right. This is Renaud. He's the COO and leader of expansion. I hope I got that one right. So yeah, Rubicon is being dubbed as trash unicorn. I found this one on multiple places. So I have no doubt that you do contribute a lot to urban recycling in your portfolio that is considerable or it's huge. So where is the biggest impact that you would see in the urban space, recycling space with Rubicon?
So, yeah, Rubicon is a tech company, and it's in the waste space. And when you look at the waste management companies in general, it's big companies with lots of vehicles, and many of them own landfills. And so it's in their interest to take your waste and bury their waste, and then they charge you for it. It's almost like a real estate business model where we all have maybe a place where we store things and we pay to have this stored. Well, it's the same thing. You pay to have your waste stored in landfills. So we have a totally different approach because we are a satellite. We don't have any trucks, we don't have any drivers, we don't have any landfills. So our incentives are very different. We're not in the business of taking trash and burying it. So that's the first thing I wanted to clarify. The second is to answer your question about urban waste, is we take an approach where we go to a city and we say, okay, what is your ambition? What do you want to achieve in terms of sustainability around waste? Well, they have this rate of recycling that they want to achieve by 2025, 2030. So we say, okay, well, what's the plan to get there? And usually they don't really have an answer. They're not really sure how to even measure it. So that's why we start by saying, we're going to help you measure so that you know where you are. Because if you want to be here and you're there, or there, or there, it's a whole different journey. So to give you a quick example, we'll use technology inside those vehicles. And we'll say, okay, well, maybe we can have an inexpensive camera that's going to be in the hopper of the vehicle where the trash is dumped. So maybe it's a vehicle that's picking up recycling. And that camera is, an expensive camera, but it's going to have a lot of power with the algorithm that we've got. People call it AI. It's very fancy, but it is. And what it's going to do, it's going to recognize a trash bag when it shouldn't be any trash bag because we're picking up cardboard, for instance. So now I can identify contamination. So it starts with giving you visibility as to, okay, you think you're recycling, you're not actually. You're picking up recycling that's contaminated with waste. So that's an example. I can give you many more examples where we use image recognition to help bring that visibility, that transparency for that city to understand where they are, what the issues are. We can give you a heat map of the neighborhoods that recycle more or less, or recycle not very well because they contaminate, etc. And with this data, then you know where you are, and then you know how you can improve over time, what you're doing is impactful or not.
All right, perfect. Seems really impressive. I also found out that you're working with governments. How much do they care? And is it genuine if they do care?
Yeah, I think there's governments that look at it as we're way behind in terms of waste and recycling. Look, I live in the US. I happen to be French. I've been in the US for 20 years now, more. I look at Europe and I think they're very sophisticated. The cities are very much more involved in general. Maybe it's because they don't have as much space as other countries. But I look at also other countries in the world that think there's no way they can catch up. And I think that, we heard about how technology can help. I think we can help make giant leaps, really help countries by showing them, hey, if you use our technology or if you use a similar technology, it doesn't have to be us, but the point is with technology, you can finally get that visibility. Let's remember that this is, like I said, an industry that's been, very opaque. It wasn't really in the advantage of the industry to communicate about how many tons they bury. They'd rather not really communicate about that. So it's very opaque. Sometimes there's a lot of gangsters involved in this industry. You know what I'm talking about? It's not just in New York. No, of course. It's been like this, but it's not like that necessarily anymore. It's changing a lot. Waste has become cool, I think, and so I think ultimately there are some countries that see the opportunity to impact their legislation to bring that visibility and that transparency and make those giant leaps into improving their recycling rates.
All right.
I just wanted to add something on that because you mentioned the waste mafia. There really is still a waste mafia. It's one of those industries that is very much dominated by these very, very dodgy characters. But this is why I think tech has such an important role to really help disrupt it. And it's exactly what Rubicon are doing. You can't manage what you can't measure, and just starting that first step of measuring what's going on, getting that transparency, understanding where the mafia are doing what they're doing, and then starting to take really targeted interventions, focused action to actually make that shift means that, catching up doesn't have to be as painful as it would be if you tried to sort of tackle it blind.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing I'll add also is that one of the main challenges that some of these countries may face is illegal dumping. And there's very simple ways to fight illegal dumping if you have the right sensors in the vehicle. And it doesn't have to be super fancy, expensive sensors. But if you listen to the vibrations made, the frequencies made by a vehicle that's actually emptying itself, and it's not in a geofenced area that's supposed to be the right place to take the recycling or the waste, that's illegal dumping right there. There's other ways also by using image recognition where you can recognize, amounts of demolition work that's just dumped on the side of the road rather than taken to an expensive place where it has to be processed.
All right, yeah. You've mentioned a couple of things that I want to ask about. So my biggest question around this panel, I would say, is why the hell is landfilling still the default option for waste disposal? And we've heard waste mafia. We've heard there's a good business. Do you guys see anything else? Why do the people don't want to shift their mindsets to even more profitable sometimes, ways of waste disposing?
I think so for construction, so that's really very much my specialism. It's in part cultural, but it's also just the way the infrastructure is set up and the logistics. So it is so much easier to send something to waste and to just let the waste companies deal with it than to actually tackle it at the source. So one of the statistics that really freaked me out when we started QFlow was that 13% of all materials that go to a construction site go direct to waste without ever being used. Now, construction as an industry in the UK has about a 2% profit margin. 40% of the amount that they spend is on materials. So they have already decimated their profit margin just by sending materials to waste without getting any value from them. And it's because it's just easier to do that. They order the wrong thing, or the wrong thing gets delivered, or they order too much because they're worried about timing. They have it stored on site, it rains, it gets damaged, it gets driven over by a forklift, and then they're like, okay, we'll send it to landfill. And that's ultimately what's happening. The other side of it is that construction sites are very space constrained. And so to have one skip, which is mixed construction waste, is much more practical than to have 3 or 4 skips or dumpsters, if you're in the US, that allow you to do timber, steel, plasterboard, and then mixed and contaminated. Now, the industry is getting better at this, and particularly in the UK, we're seeing much more segregation on site, which means that they are managing to divert more from landfill. But in the US, where we also work, it's primarily just mixed construction waste, and there's very little oversight of where it goes. The final thing that, sorry, I'm going on, but the final thing that really does this is like the cost. And the environmental cost of sending waste to landfill is not reflected in the cost of sending waste to landfill. It's about £250 per skip in the UK, which is expensive compared to the US, where it's way cheaper. And so actually there's very little incentive for construction companies and manufacturers and waste suppliers to really change the way they're operating until, in the same way with carbon, until we start reflecting that cost financially, it's going to be very difficult to get this industry to shift. And we talked earlier about what those sorts of big mechanisms would be in terms of carbon pricing. There does need to be a bit of a burning of the boats scenario here, where we say, actually, the cost of sending stuff to landfill is now £1,000 per skip. Now you go figure it out.
All right. Maybe next question when I see Daniel taking the microphone. This one is definitely for you. Let's talk among the problem space of recycling and technology. There's a lot of amazing technology already existing that is able to address a lot of the issues with recycling rates versus landfilling. But I feel like there's a general lack of awareness about these tech solutions that are often really amazing. So what are the ways you would go about increasing the adoption rates of already existing technologies?
So I think, which also kind of ties a little bit into your previous question, awareness is one big point. I think also one reason, which might be an add-on to what you said, is that, okay, I've always been doing it that way, and it's really hard to change a habit. And I think awareness might also be a solution for uncovering technologies which are for many still hidden. And here it really helps to also consult external providers which have an overview of potential, not just decarbonization matters, where I'd be rather coming from, but also anything in regards to the increased recycling rates and increased adoption here. Also in that regard, I initially, hearing about this panel, was quickly wondering, because I'm rather coming from the angle of decarbonization and carbon, as you said correctly. However, I feel actually both topics go very much hand in hand in many ways. Sometimes there's a contradiction, but most times I think they go hand in hand. And it absolutely makes sense that those two camps talk closer to each other, because, as mentioned, sometimes there might be a trade-off. There might be materials, for example, companies could design their products with, which are really nice to recycle, however, might have a higher carbon footprint. So there is a trade-off, and in the end, it is about to take a holistic decision. And in the end, it's also the companies who should take responsibility for the products they are selling, no matter what happens to them afterwards, whether they are recycled or reused or whatever, they are landing in landfill. So it's really important actually that we get also the companies on board who are selling the products, who have to be kind of, let's say their responsibilities should increase, and they should also see what they can do with their products to actually recycling is rather not the most preferable option. Initially, we should rather focus on making lifetime as long as possible, making it reusable, making it refurbishable, and then further down the line, recyclable.
And if I may add to this, I think that was a really good point about the companies that are putting pressure on themselves more and more because their customers, their employees, their shareholders are asking, what's going on with the waste that you generate? You have to report on that, whether it's through ESG or whatever other KPIs you use. You're going to have a responsibility to talk about what you do with your waste, how much of it is reinjected in the economy, how much of it is generated year over year. So that's a healthy pressure that consumers can put on those companies, employees, board members, and it's valid also for cities. Citizens can say, you know, it used to be out of sight, out of mind. You picked up my waste, then I didn't care for it. But now I actually want to know, because I make the effort to recycle, is it actually being recycled? Some people ask these questions in some cities. The answer is not very good. It's like, well, actually, you thanks for recycling, but it's actually all dumped in the same landfill. What do you mean? Oh, it was because we wanted to start getting you trained on how to recycle. Really? You know, that's a perfect article that could be the front page. So the point is that there is some healthy pressure and responsibility, whether it's businesses or government, to actually communicate on the progress they're making towards improving recycling.
Oh yeah, great insight. Love that.
Can I just add on that? Sorry.
Sure.
I think one thing you touched on there was that cultural behavioural change and sort of talking about the barriers to adoption of technology. I think one thing that we definitely see is having really high inertia in this industry, in the waste industry in general, is that sort of the emotional cost of changing your processes and this fear of the change. And one thing that sort of software providers like us need to do is make sure that any system we're implementing is as easy to use and as possible. And that sort of barrier to adoption is super, super low. And that, I think, will help, you know, get over that hump of, oh, I have to do something new. Oh, I don't want to do that. And then all of a sudden they start using it and they're like, oh, okay, no, actually that's not as painful as I thought it was. And I think for any kind of shift that you're asking for in behavior change, it's got to be easy, it's got to be transparent, and the value of it has to be communicated back. So that piece around, well, why am I separating my tin cans if you're just going to send them to landfill anyway? The transparency around that and the data that sits behind it is so important to reinforce that behavior change, which again is kind of where the tech comes in.
All right, thank you. Quick question to Renaud. Hand in hand with adoption goes scaling. There's some technological and non-technological advancements or solutions. that are, usable, being used at some point. But how do you scale? Do you have a tip for successfully scaling that your company has managed to do that, I think?
Yeah. So one thing we did is, well, let me put it this way. When I sit in front of a city and I asked, how many trucks do you have? And they say, well, I have 100 trucks. Okay. And we're talking about waste trucks. And I say, okay, what do your waste trucks do? And they look at me like I'm an idiot and they say, well, they pick up waste, Renaud. And I'm like, okay, but what else do they pick up? Waste. What about other data points they could pick up? If you put the right sensors, the right technology, you could pick up data that could make your city smarter, whether it's related to waste or not. It could be about your road conditions, it could be about your lighting, it could be about your illegal parking, whatever it is. And I'm not saying we have a solution for every of those issues, but potholes was an issue that they brought up and that we were able to address by scanning the roads and being able to use AI, image recognition, and make a difference between an oil stain and an actual pothole. So now you can map all of that, and you didn't have to buy, or pay some auditors to go every street every day. You take your existing truck, which is the one vehicle that will go in every street of your city at least once a week. So leverage that. So I think that's the idea, is to answer your question as far as scaling, is to take advantage of some assets that are out there. And potholes is an example. I don't want to steal my thunder because I'm supposed to speak after this, and I don't want to say everything I'm about to say again. But the point here is that you have to have a humble approach and go to the city and say, look, I won't know your city as well as you know your city. So I'm not here to tell you, here's what you need to do, but tell me about your challenges and then see if I can find a solutions or customize it for you, because we have deployed in many cities. In the US, we're over 100 cities. So we have an idea of what those challenges are.
Cool. So yeah, surprise, surprise. I want to raise the topic of AI in this space because everybody of you mentioned it, and there's literally AI in sustainability in the word itself. So what role is AI playing in the line of work that you do? And do you consider it a solution, or is it still a part of the problem? Whoever feels like.
You want me to take that one?
You all do AI, I think.
Okay, so maybe I've spoken enough. Maybe you guys want. I'm happy to take that one, but go ahead.
Well, from our perspective, I mean, AI is just a tool. It's a very clever piece of technology, and you can focus it at different problems, but in the end, it's just helping us do what we do more efficiently, more quickly, more at a much bigger scale as well. I'm a civil engineer, so I much prefer the big, heavy technology as opposed to the ethereal AI. I'm probably not being fair to it. But I think the fixation on AI probably isn't helpful for legacy industries like waste or construction. It is either seen as this big, scary, ethereal thing that they don't understand and probably don't trust, or it's seen as something that's so out of reach that they don't really want to engage with it. And so we actually try and keep our AI behind a screen, and we actually don't talk too much about it with our clients, except those that express a really direct interest. And actually the bit that they interact with is as clean and as simple as possible. Now AI powers that, but we don't want to put it in their faces because it's just not appropriate for this industry, or at least that's what we've found with our clients.
Actually, I have a very, very similar answer. I can only support you here. We use it also as a tool at various angles to make the life of our clients easier, to derive the carbon footprint of their organization as fast as possible. In that regard, we can use AI for classification in regards to emission factors. And the other thing is to suggest the best measures to decarbonize in the next step. These are the two means. Again, as you mentioned, it's a tool. And actually, we should also, in my eyes, really, it's a technology or a tech decision whether it's actually needed or if you can use something else, because also AI has a certain footprint, training those models, etc., and certain implications. So it's sometimes not even needed for certain problems, but sometimes also very much helpful.
I was going to say, I heard this horrible statistic the other day that one query in ChatGPT is the equivalent of running a light bulb for 6 hours. And I was like, ooh. So as a company that's trying to push decarbonisation, we do have to think carefully about the mechanisms that we use to do that as well, and whether they are long-term, sustainable, and in line with our values.
All right, yeah, one downside of ChatGPT that I see is I feel really, really dumb whenever it's down. Yeah, one interesting question I have written down just before this panel, and I want to use the opportunity that you all work in kind of like different geos, is legislation is, and this is a very similar approach to the question that I stated for AI. In your geo, is it more of a problem or is it more of a solution? We have EU, we have Great Britain or UK, and we have US.
So we're not just the US, we're also present in Japan, for instance. I think a lot of the times we're in a position where we have our values as a company, we have a mission to end waste. And so we just look at other cities, governments that have similar values, that also want to end waste one way or the other. It's a very ambitious goal. I'm not saying, you can do this overnight, but when you are talking to people who share that objective, because their citizens want it, because they want it, then it's much easier. But I wouldn't say I'm doing, proper lobbying. It's just more like talking with people and about the issues they have and how we can address them. So I would say that I don't see this so much as a barrier as far as I'm concerned. That's just my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, we operate in the UK, US, and Australia. And although there are differences in regulation across the world around waste, and the UK is definitely the most intensive in terms of reporting around waste and requiring that breakdown, I think everyone across the globe gets that waste is bad and ultimately wants to reduce it, not just from an environmental perspective, but also from an economic one. I think the main variation we see sort of between geographies is how quick that ROI can be realized, normally depending on how well they're regulated. So the return on investment in terms of managing waste in the UK is much quicker than in the US, but there's still the appetite and the interest to reduce waste.
Maybe bringing one more angle to that, in the EU, there are the corporate laws kind of coming up, the CSRD, for example, starting from next year, which is forcing tons of companies, over 50,000 companies in the EU, to report on their sustainability matters. And suddenly, actually, this obviously helps a lot, right? Because so many companies who didn't do anything before have to do something now. However, you also see the topic sometimes shifting a little bit, because previously, for some companies, it had to be voluntary, or it was voluntary, and companies did it to be proud of what they do and show that. Now they have to do so. Suddenly the focus is slightly changing, actually, and also the attitude towards it. Now we have to do it. It's kind of a little bit, I feel like with children, whether they do something because they like to do it or they do something because they have to do it, is a very different way of looking at it. Yeah.
Cool, perfect. Some brilliant insights from the panelists. Now we have a couple of minutes left, so I would love to give some space to the audience, to some audience questions.
If you have any questions, ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to address any questions for our panelists. I'm sure there will be some. You're very much encouraged. Yeah, we have one question.
What is next step in construction industry for next 5 years?
Small question. Construction around the world is going through a bit of a shift. I think there has been a big focus on decarbonising the operation of buildings. Most people are already on that journey and are getting quite comfortable with mitigating scope 1 and 2. They've suddenly realised that scope 3 is this huge Goliath of a challenge that they need to address, and for construction, that's 90%. And that sits not just, within the day-to-day of the building, but actually the huge supply chain that services construction, from material manufacturers and transport and all of that. So I think the next 5 years for construction is going to be partly just trying to keep their head above water. The inflation that's going on across particularly Europe, UK and US, and the impact that that's had on material supply chains means that there are a lot of companies that are just struggling to stay buoyant. And I think the next sort of 18 months is going to be a bit of a culling of the herd in a way. Then sort of once they've dealt with their immediate cash flow issues and things start to unlock again, which inevitably they will, there is going to be a big focus on resilience in infrastructure, particularly as the worst impacts of climate change start affecting different countries in different ways. And as part of that, a big focus will be on mitigating that scope 3 carbon. So what we're starting to see is a lot of push from the top down to get proper transparency, get proper data on what constitutes their supply chain, not just their first supplier, but everything that sits beneath that. And that's not necessarily just from a carbon perspective, but it's also from a resilience perspective. And this was made very clear to UK companies when the war in Ukraine kicked off. Timber, for example, was now listed as a conflict material. Most of the timber in the UK comes from parts of Russia and Belarus. All of a sudden, they had to shift their timber supply chain. And so getting a clear picture of where your materials are coming from, where your vulnerabilities are, not just from a war and conflict perspective, but also from a supply chain, from a climate resilience perspective, is going to be a huge priority for all parts of that supply chain. I think the next 5 years is going to be very interesting, very challenging.
Do we have another question? Because if not, I will have one. Yeah, one more.
Thank you, guys. My question is if there is any viable solution now to submeter the waste consumption, for example, big buildings, offices, retails, when there is a need to submeter, for example, waste of tenants. If you could comment, thanks.
No volunteers, another canon of questions directed at Brittany.
We do get asked this a lot. So Qflow as a system can be used in a facilities management perspective because it is, relatively idiot-proof. You just take a picture. It can be used at a sort of sub-tenant level, and you can say, right, your tenants now need to be logging this. It's not been applied in that way yet because the reality is that although people like the idea of it, they can't really be asked to go through the process of actually doing it, particularly as landlords trying to get their tenants to change behaviours around energy consumption is a higher priority right now than waste. However, I do think that is starting to come through. And it was interesting when we moved into our office space, there was no recycling in the building. And this is in London. And I was sort of like, this is a bit weird. And so we asked the guys who ran the offices, guys, where's the recycling? Where's the food waste bins? Where's the prayer room? We have a lot of Muslims in our team that need a prayer room. There was just all these things they hadn't really thought about. And by asking the question, literally within a couple of months, there was recycling and there was a prayer room. And we were like, way. So I think it's something that will come through, but it's going to take a combination of consumers asking for it and then also sort of top down a bit of legislation and investment to try and make that a priority.
Thank you so very much. So the last one, as promised, from me, whoever would like to address. But you started, Brittany, with a couple of thought-provoking statistics, the big stats about landfills and percentage-wise how much ends up unrecycled in landfills. So here's a question for you. Looking at the entire landscape of what gets recycled, what doesn't, and how tech applies to all that, what is your level of satisfaction now when you look at this entire... When you look at it, do you think that we are recycling, or are we rather pretending we're recycling because there's not enough pressure? Many of you touched on the issue of whether, why producers have no participation whatsoever, in most cases take no responsibility for even the worst of products that they contribute to the market. So my question is, how satisfied are you with how we are approaching recycling at this stage in the tech growth? On a scale of 1 to 10 to make it easier for you. Are we serious about it, or are we pretending we're doing it?
I'll give you a quick example. I know we're running out of time, but some of our customers, I'm not talking cities, I'm talking businesses, will have thousands of stores in the US. And for every store, they have a bin for recycling, a bin for waste. And for every time we have somebody pick that up, we'll measure the weight, we'll be able to basically give them an understanding of what their recycling rate is. And we started gamifying this in a sense that it's become another KPI amongst many others, that a general manager for every of those stores, he has to get his bonus based on his sales performance, his customer satisfaction, and his recycling rate. And that's possible because now it's something we can track. So from where I stand, to answer your question, I'd give it a 6, just to be above 5, because I am optimistic to see that when you are able to measure, you can measure your progress or not, and people want to succeed naturally. So especially if there are bonuses associated to it.
So it's your optimistic personality that drives your personal bias.
Yeah.
I see. So it's 6. Who gives bigger or less than 6?
I think for construction, where we practically are today, and it varies country to country. UK probably like a 5. US, I'm sorry,
5,
like a 2.
Still generous.
But where they actually want to be, I think the appetite is to be up near sort of 7, 8. Like there is good intention. It's just the execution's a bit fuzzy.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I would give the topic also a 6 right now, answering I think it's regionally highly different, so I can rather reply from my region. I think recycling there is a lot of focus on the topic. However, what I think is even more of a topic is how much waste is produced. This is insane. Like reduction as a first step should absolutely be priority, and here I'm absolutely not satisfied at all.
I'm sure everyone in this room agrees. And the final voice?
Yeah, I would give it a 2 because I'm coming from the hardcore tech scene and I see so many possibilities still out there. So this gives us a lot of room for improvement and a lot of room for opportunities.
So from 2 to 6, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Thank you. Once again, a round of applause,
Thank you,
please.
guys.